So I thought I would explain how I take notes from books. As some of you might know, I'm a very avid reader. I love to read books and information, new ideas. But there were some ways that I do this, some smart ways that I do this that not only save me time, but make the whole thing more, so that I get more out of it, basically. So it's based on the Pareto principle, which is the idea that 20% of your actions will give you 80% of your results. So 20% of the things you read, let's say, will give you 80% of the insights that you actually use. So how do you focus on that 20% so that you don't waste your time reading the 80% that you're not going to use? That's basically what it's come down to with me. So I've made some notes here, and there's a few things that I want to explain. So let's just get right into it. So the first one is to, of course, read, to actually read the book. And to do so, you need to actually focus on wanting to understand the content instead of just skimming through the words. You need to understand what's being said. Otherwise, you can't do anything with that information. It's just kind of going in one ear and out the other, or in one eye and out the other. Okay, so the next thing, when you do come across this 20% or these golden nuggets of the book that you're actually going to use, you need to highlight them. And if you're reading a physical book, of course, you can write down actual highlights. If you're reading a Kindle book, you can highlight on the Kindle, and then at the end of the book, when you're finished, you can send the highlights to your email address so that you then have a PDF of the most effective, useful bits from the book. And then that is essentially like 5% of that book that you can study later in much less time and kind of refresh your memory on the important bits. That becomes important later on. If you're reading a physical book and using a physical highlighter with ink, like old school style, right? That's fine too, because there is several programs which will do what we call image to text capture. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you finished a book, a physical one, you've highlighted all this stuff, but now you need to get those notes onto your computer somehow to maybe use in an article that you want to quote, or maybe to have on your phone or whatever. You can get these programs that capture the text. You take a picture of the pages, captures the text, you take the highlights and put it into your whatever, your mind map, your document or whatever. Okay. And the next step, arguably the most important one, is you need to synthesize what you've learned. So you need to essentially kind of consolidate it, look over your important highlights and notes again, make sure you understand them, and ideally make a plan for how you can actually use these notes. Like, what are you going to do with this information? And I'm going to get onto in a second 2 very, very important tips as well for before you even start reading. But you need to synthesize. You need to collect basically and reread the highlights you've just made. So you've read the book once, you've got rid of all the fluff, you've narrowed it down to like some important highlights. Read the highlights again, and then make a plan for how you're going to use those highlights. Okay, so the last 2 tips that are arguably the most important and powerful tips. So the first one is before you even start reading, I should have put this at the beginning, to start thinking before you even buy and read a book, think about who wrote the book, and are they what their credentials are, what they do, how much authority they have. Because if you read a book, if you spend 3 hours, let's say, reading a book from somebody who just does not know what they're talking about, or they don't really have much authority, you're wasting your time. You're basically summarizing an opinion from somebody else that is not accurate. So my favorite books are the non-fiction type, where you have an author who's an expert in their field, and that author in their book is comparing dozens of studies, or they're drawing on experience from loads of people. An example of this is Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss. So although Tim, you could say, is an authority in himself, in Tools of Titans, what he does is he interviews a whole bunch of millionaires and asks them what's their most effective tool, tip, or piece of advice for how to become a millionaire. So this is using the knowledge not only of Tim, but he's summarizing essentially knowledge from a whole bunch of different people who might have authority. And there's a bunch of examples about this. There's a book I read about near-death experiences where it summarizes studies on that, and you have all kinds of ones like that. So try with the books you choose to read, try and make sure the person has some authority, and B, the person is drawing on sources outside of themselves. They're talking about data, they're talking about, more than one person's experience. And the final tip, probably the most important, is don't read something unless you actually need to read it. This should really go without saying, but let's say if you're reading business books, you want to start a business, as an example. If you start reading, if you've just started and the first book you pick up is like how to scale a company and hire loads of employees, that's completely irrelevant at the first few years of your business. It's completely pointless to be reading that before you actually need it. You should instead read something like the $100 Startup, for example, or the 4-Hour Work Week, something that will actually be relevant to you now, that you can actually use, instead of just spending your time reading books that the information that you're reading won't be relevant to you for several years. So do you see what I mean? You need to be focused on what, it's like a need to know basis. You need to read what you need to know in the moment and then actually use it. You know, I've wasted probably too much time reading books that just didn't apply to me in the moment. They were things that I could use later, but they weren't relevant in the moment. So I've learned this the hard way. Let me know in the comments your favorite book of all time and why.